Now let's make some intense areas in the sky to kind of show where the light is peeking through here. So we will create a new layer, make it a screen composite method, and let's call it Sky Glow. And we will use the glow brush for this. Now the trick with the glow brush is to pick darker colors so that you don't blow out your highlights and make them too white. We want our highlights and our lightest areas to be a pale yellow or a bright yellow rather than white, so we don't want this to build up to white too quick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a dark orange color, something like this, and I'm going to try painting and I'm going to see what I get. If you scrub back and forth in the same spot, you'll start to see it build up. Now I think that might be too bright, so I'm going to shift it a little bit more towards red-orange, and I'm going to go darker down towards the bottom here and paint. And that's not quite vivid enough, so I'm going to shift it a little bit more. I think that's what I want there. Kind of a dark orange-red. So I'm going to paint with that, and that's going to lighten these areas, and it's going to make it look like the sun is back there glowing through. So I'm scrubbing back and forth pretty firmly here. And then I'm going to take kind of brighter red color, maybe a bigger brush, put in some red glowing light. When I try to keep it near the glowing area, you don't want to go too high with it. And I'm going to take a kind of lighter orange. And this will be right where the sun is here. You can use a smaller brush to put in some little fine details near the bottom. But again, you don't want it to really build up to white. You want this nice yellow glow as your lightest color here. Being a little sloppy about it, and that's okay because I can go ahead and blend it now if I want to. So now that we have this nice glow here, we'll keep the clouds dark layers separate, but we'll merge the sky glow and the sky layer. So I just move the clouds dark up. I'm going to merge these two layers. We'll call it sky. And now we can blend it a little bit using the diffuse blur brush. The reason why we're keeping those dark clouds separate is because we want them to kind of be in front of everything else. And if we're blending right now, if it were on the same layer, we'd be blending them together with our light color, which wouldn't be good. So this way we can just blend behind them. I'm just softening this detail in this light area so it doesn't stand out so much. And then I'm going to zoom out and evaluate what I have and see if it looks good. And I think it does. Next, let's add some highlights to these darker clouds here because the light source is behind them, so they would have a little bit of light peeking around the edges. So we'll go ahead and just paint on this sky layer. We'll select the glow brush, and we're going to want to sample colors in the sky that are surrounding the clouds. So I'm going to sample this orange, and of course I'm going to make it a little bit darker. And I'm going to paint with a kind of smaller glow brush here around the edges of the cloud where they are closest to the sun. So let's say the sun is about right here in this lightest area. So the sun could be touching the top of the cloud and the bottom. In this case, you just want just a little indication of something. It doesn't have to be very distinct. I'm going to sample again one of these colors surrounding this cloud. That's just to make sure that you're getting the right hue. Give that a little bit of highlight. And I'm going to sample for the cloud on the far right and give it a little bit of highlight. I'm going to sample this orange again. Now this one's going to have the most highlights because it's the closest to the light source, and they're going to be mostly on the top because the light's not coming from underneath very much. And we'll do the last cloud on the left and give it some highlights, mainly on the top. Right, now they really look like they're floating in front of the light source. If you go too strong with this, you can always blend it a little bit using the diffuse blur. That'll kind of take out some of the detail there and make it blend in a little bit better. that looks pretty good for the clouds. So we'll go ahead and start working on the tree next. The first thing that we'll do is we'll add a new layer. We'll call it sketch, because we want to have a good idea of where our tree is going to be before we start drawing it. We'll set our sketch layer to multiply, and we'll select the detail oils brush. The reason why this is important is because if you just start drawing a tree, you might end up going way off the canvas, and it's kind of one of those things that keeps growing as you're drawing it. So you want to make sure that you have an idea of where you want it to be in your composition. So let's say it's going to fill no more than this area here for the branches, and then our trunk will go kind of down here. So that's about the easiest tree you can draw there. But this is just going to be a sketch. So I'm going to turn down the opacity of that layer so that we can make it a little less distinct. And then underneath that sketch layer, I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm going to call this trunk. This will be our tree trunk. Let's make this a multiply composite method, and it's just going to be silhouetted, so we'll go ahead and just make it black in this case. And we'll select the scratch board tool for our trunk. Now, you want your trunk to be widest at the bottom, and you want it to get thinner as you go towards the top. I'm going to kind of have mine fork off kind of in the middle here and fork into some smaller branches. So I'm going to start with a brush that's about as wide as how wide I think I want the trunk to be. I'm going to start out pushing down really firmly and then ease up on my pressure as I reach the top. That way I do a tapered stroke like so. Might make my brush a little bit smaller. And you can always widen the bottom by doing multiple strokes. I'm kind of using lighter pressure here. These are going to be my main forks. I'm not going to try to copy the example exactly, because that would be impossible and it wouldn't be any fun. So when you're painting your tree, you go ahead and make it however you want. Don't try to copy every single branch, because you'll see as I get through this, I'm going to make so many branches that you wouldn't be able to follow me even if you tried. So there's our trunk. Now, the trick here is that we are going to separate our layers, or our tree components, into layers. So we have our trunk, but we're going to make more layers for the branches that get smaller and smaller and smaller. And the reason why is because there's going to be so many branches. At some point, it's going to be nice to be able to hide and reveal these layers so that you can focus on the unfinished branches rather than getting overwhelmed by the whole tree. We'll also occasionally change the color of the branches. Sometimes they'll be dark so we can see what they're supposed to look like when they're finished, and sometimes they will be other more vibrant colors so that they stand out from each other. So for example, I'm going to make the next layer limbs. Now, I know that I'm going to have to give these all a bunch of unique names, and I'm going to have limbs and branches and twigs, and I know they're all kind of the same thing, but limbs is going to be the bigger, thicker branches. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that I can see better. Now for the limbs, I'm going to use the scratch board tool again, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Control and Alt on my keyboard and tap and drag with my pen, and that's going to let me resize my brush on the fly. I kind of resize my brush up against the branch so that I can see that I have the right size, and then you want to make sure that your brush is just a little bit smaller than the last branches that you made. That way you'll make sure that they're smaller, because as these branches fork, they're going to get smaller and smaller. You can use the bracket keys on your keyboard to just nudge it a bit smaller. I'll do a test, and that's a good size. It's not as thick as the last branch that I drew. So I'm also going to change the color now to something like this vibrant blue. It's not going to stay that color. I'm just going to keep it this color so that I can see the difference between the trunk and the limbs that I'm drawing. This will really help. So these are going to be the next largest branches. I'm doing those tapering strokes where I'm starting down, pressing hard, and then I'm letting up my pressure. I'm trying to kind of give the branches some character too by not making them all straight. Some of them will curve and do weird little shapes. So like that one has a little bit of a kink. You want some of the branches to overlap each other too, but you don't have to start doing that until a little bit later if you want. That will work for now for the limbs. We'll create another layer. Let's call it branches. Let's use bright yellow for these. Now we want these to be smaller or thinner in diameter, so I'm going to use the left bracket key to make my brush smaller. Looks like a good size. And then I'm going to put in these branches here. Now, in my example, I spent a lot of time drawing branches, and I started drawing and kind of took a break, and then I started drawing again because I really wanted to make a very, very detailed piece. Now, you may not want to spend that much time drawing branches, and you don't necessarily have to. You could make a more dead tree that maybe a lot of the branches have fallen off and there's only a trunk and a couple branches. That's totally fine. The goal here is not to draw the most complex tree that you can, it's just to get a feel for how to draw trees in general. And at the ends of these thicker branches, that's where I'm kind of trying to thin them out more with these smaller ones. You'll notice occasionally I'll overlap the layers that are on top with the layers that are underneath. Like here, this yellow overlaps the blue a little bit. That's always good. Okay, that will work for our branches. Create another new layer, and let's call this small branches. Let's pick a bright green that we can see. We'll zoom in a little bit more. Each time you're probably going to have to zoom in closer and closer so that you can see what you're doing. You want to make sure that your branches connect to each other. You don't want to have any ones that are just kind of floating on their own like that. That's not going to look good. They have to be connected. You also want to make sure you have the right brush size. So my brush needs to be a little bit bigger. I think that will work. Okay, small branches. Just going to start putting them in. You'll notice as you start getting smaller and smaller with your branches, you're going to have more branches to have to paint in. So that's why I mentioned earlier, you probably want to watch how many branches you decide to put in, because you could be working on this painting for quite a while. It's very good practice though. And you'll notice I don't have to absolutely stay within my boundary here, but I want to try to keep my tree within the boundaries of the canvas, so I'm not going to go out that far outside of it. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to put in all these branches yet. I'm going to just focus on a little area here, and then I'll do a really quick time lapse of me filling them all in so that you don't have to sit here and listen to me talk for hours while I draw on these branches. So make another layer, and we will call this twigs. And we'll make the twigs maybe this hot pink magenta color. Use the scratchboard tool again and size our brush nice and small here. These are going to be our twigs. Now it's also up to you how fine you want to make these branches, because you can keep going smaller and smaller and smaller down to the point to where you can't even see the branches anymore. But that, again, that's up to you. I wanted to make this particular lesson have options for people who want the kind of easier way or the more challenging way. So to make it more challenging, you can just keep making more branches. And I always like a challenge. A tree is one of those things where there aren't too many shortcuts. If you want 1,000 branches, you have to paint 1,000 branches. There's really no way around it. I find this kind of thing enjoyable though. It's kind of relaxing. After a while, your arm will get tired, and it's good to take a break. You'll also want to focus on what you've accomplished versus what you have left. If I look back at my tree, I go, oh man, look at all these branches I'm going to have to draw. This is going to take me forever. But, I mean, look at how much I've gotten completed here. Another thing you can do that'll kind of help you visualize, once you've gotten a lot of these branches in here, you can always turn on Preserve Transparency, select black, and then use the scratchboard, a big scratchboard brush, to paint over your limbs so that you can at least get a feeling for how it's going to look when we have it the appropriate color. You could also turn off your sketch and look and see. And that's kind of a weird tree. It doesn't look very natural. I of course need to keep adding in my branches, which I will continue to do here in a time lapse. So we're gonna fast forward in time a little bit, and then we'll meet up again when I have more branches here on this tree. So I'm just gonna kind of jump around a little bit here. Sometimes I will work on the green branches, sometimes I'll work on the yellow ones, sometimes I'll work on the pink ones, kind of just giving myself some variety. But what's important is that while you're painting, you pay absolutely careful attention to which layer you're painting on, because if you mix these different sizes of branches up, the whole effect isn't going to work anymore. So a lot of the reason why we're keeping these separate is because it helps you focus on the unfinished branches, as I mentioned before. So you can see that the yellow ones need more green ones, and the green ones need more pink ones, and so on. And if you wanted to hide the layers now and then, you could, to make it easier to see what you're working on. But again, I'm just trying to make these nice forks, trying not to go out too far outside of my shape here that I've established in my sketch. And I'm really concentrating on one area at a time, kind of going around the tree in kind of a clockwise fashion, and focusing more on the edges, because the edges are very important. They're going to be looked at a lot more than the center of the tree. The center of the tree is going to have so many overlapping branches that if you put too much detail in the center, it's almost a waste of time. Okay, I'm coming out of time warp here, and I'm going to zoom out and just evaluate what I have. I'm going to turn on preserve transparency, and I'm just going to paint these all in black again. It's always good to get a feel for how it's coming together. That's starting to look more like a tree. You'll be able to see the areas that need a little more work. They won't look right. The areas that are nice and overlapping are the good areas, and then where you have these weird awkward gaps, that's where you want to fill in. Now, as far as painting goes, what you can do is you can hide these layers, like the limbs and the branches, if you wanted to, and then you could focus on just specific areas. That helps sometimes. I'm going to make another layer for fine twigs and turn off preserve transparency. And when you get down to the very, very fine twigs, if you want to go that far, you'll want to switch to the detail oils brush, and that will just make a better looking fine twig. You'll want to use a pretty small brush for this. And you can draw your twigs, your very, very fine twigs. If you want to go finer than this, you can go finer than this. I mean, if you want to spend extraordinary amounts of time on this, go for it. Because that's just going to make a much more interesting and more realistic looking tree the more time you spend on it. I'll turn on my sketch so I can remember where everything's at. Now I'm going to concentrate these fine twigs just on this pink. I'm not going to put them on anything else because I'm trying to keep this hierarchy here, keeping the bigger branches separate from the smaller branches. You'll also want to make sure that you save often. So I'm going to do a save as. You want to put your name in the title of the piece. Put lesson 1 since this is the first lesson, and then I use -1 for my first save, -2 for my second save, and so on. And I keep these saves just in case I need to go back. I might make a mistake or something, or I might try something I don't like, and it's nice to go back to the older versions. You want to also avoid using any special characters. Don't use spaces in your file name. Just use these hyphens instead of spaces. So I'm going to go ahead and save often, because once you've made 1,000 of these branches, if your computer crashes and you lose all that effort, you're going to be pretty irritated. Also, if you find that you're kind of starting to run off the canvas, what you can do is you can select all of your tree layers and you can group them. We call it tree, and then we'll probably want to include our sketch in that too. We'll move that layer down, then you can get a little bit more room so that your branches aren't all going off the canvas. That just makes for a better composition overall. Okay, so I've jumped ahead a little bit to a different example. This is the more finished example, and if we hide the sky for a second, you can see all these layers are broken up. I have the fine twigs, and I have the twigs and the small branches, and everything is nice and separate. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to paint all of these in the appropriate color. So I'm going to select the scratchboard tool, make sure preserve transparency is on, select black with a pretty big brush, and I want to make sure I paint over the whole tree so that I get all of the branches and twigs. Being zoomed out helps also. You can see this is starting to look like a finished tree. There we go. Now if you notice after you do this, if there's still some awkward gaps in here, just go in and just focus on just those areas and fill them in. But I think this looks pretty good.